My name is Jack, and I've always believed in the power of a friendly smile and a warm handshake. But that belief was shattered the day I moved into my new home on Crescent Avenue. The house was everything I had hoped for: spacious, charming, and in a quiet neighborhood. It seemed perfect, or at least it did at first. My neighbors, however, were not what I expected. The house next door was large, older, and looked like something out of a Gothic novel. Its tall iron gate and ivy-covered stone walls gave it an imposing presence. The owner, Mrs. Langley, was an elderly woman who rarely left her home. I had only seen her once when she waved to me from her front porch, but something about her smile sent a chill down my spine. At first I thought I was just being paranoid. After all, she was elderly, and I told myself that it was silly to assume the worst. But then, the strange things began. It started with the invitations. At least, that's what I called them. Every morning, I would find a small, elegant envelope on my doorstep. The paper was thick, and the handwriting was neat and old-fashioned. Each invitation contained the same words: "Please join me for tea at your earliest convenience. I look forward to your company." I never saw anyone deliver them, but there they were, every single morning. The first few times, I thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe someone was playing a prank, but no one else in the neighborhood seemed to have received one. Curiosity got the better of me. One evening, I decided to accept the invitation. It wasn't like I had anything else planned, and Mrs. Langley was always so kind when we waved at each other. I walked over to her house, unsure of what to expect. When I arrived, the gate creaked open, as if it had been waiting for me. The path to the front door was lined with flowers that seemed to glow under the moonlight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The front door swung open as I approached, revealing Mrs. Langley standing in the doorway, smiling her unsettling smile. "Jack, so lovely to see you," she said, in a voice that was sweet but had an odd edge to it. "Please, come in." I stepped inside, trying to hide my unease. The house was dark, save for the flickering light of candles in the hallway. It smelled of lavender and something older, like dust and time. Mrs. Langley led me into a grand parlor, where a small table was set with fine china and a steaming teapot. "Please, sit," she said, motioning to a chair opposite her. I sat down, trying to act casual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As she poured the tea, I noticed her hands were trembling slightly, her skin pale and thin. She seemed frail, but there was an intensity in her eyes that unnerved me. We chatted for a while about nothing in particular, but my mind was racing. Every time I glanced around, I saw strange things: antique portraits on the walls, old books stacked in corners, and a large, ornate mirror that seemed to reflect something I couldn't quite place. Suddenly, the conversation took a strange turn. "Do you like tea, Jack?" she asked, her smile widening. I do," I said, my voice shaking slightly. She leaned in closer, her smile never faltering. "You must drink it all, my dear. It's very important." I hesitated, but then she gave me a look that sent a shiver down my spine. I picked up my cup and drank the tea in one swift motion. It tasted strange, but I couldn't quite place the flavor. As soon as I finished, everything changed. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls shrinking. The temperature dropped, and I began to feel lightheaded. Mrs. Langley's smile grew wider, her eyes now glowing with an unnatural light. "Welcome to my home, Jack," she said softly. "I've been waiting for you." Before I could react, I felt myself being pulled into a trance-like state. My body went numb, and I could no longer move. The room around me seemed to shift and twist, and I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision. Mrs. Langley's voice echoed in my ears, but I couldn't make out the words. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my own house. The room was dark, and I felt cold. It was like nothing had happened, but I knew it had. I could still taste the strange tea on my tongue, still feel the weight of the experience pressing down on me. I haven't seen Mrs. Langley since that night, but sometimes I feel her presence, waiting, and every morning, without fail, I find a new invitation waiting for me on my doorstep, but this time, I know better. I won't go back. I can't, because I'm not sure if I ever really left. My name is Lisa, and I thought I knew what it meant to be cautious. I've always been the type to be aware of my surroundings, always keeping my guard up. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered when I moved into my new house on Evergreen Road. The house was beautiful, vintage cottage with a large garden, perfect for a fresh start. It was tucked away from the busy streets, offering the kind of tranquility I needed after years of city life. My neighbors were distant, but that didn't bother me. I preferred peace, especially after everything I had been through. The house next door, however, was a different story. The family that lived there had been there as long as anyone could remember, but there was something off about them. The father, Mr. Harris, always kept to himself. His wife, Mrs. Harris, was rarely seen, and their son, Ben, was even more mysterious. He was a quiet, brooding teenager who spent all his time in his room, or so it seemed. But it was the house itself that unnerved me. The curtains were always drawn, even in the dead of summer. The windows were dark, and despite the fact that there were usually cars in the driveway, the place felt empty. It was as though no one truly lived there, just shadows and memories. One night, I was sitting in my living room, reading a book, when I heard something strange, a soft thumping sound, coming from next door. It wasn't like normal noise. It was rhythmic, almost like something was being dragged across the floor. I tried to ignore it, but the sound continued, growing louder as the night went on. Curiosity got the best of me. I went outside to see if I could figure out what was causing the noise. The Harris house was dark, but I could hear the thumping clearly now. It was coming from inside the house, from the room upstairs. I decided to approach the house. Maybe something had fallen, or perhaps one of them had accidentally knocked something over. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still, no answer. I walked around the side of the house, hoping to find some sign of life. The back door was slightly ajar, and the light inside was flickering. My heart raced as I stepped through the door, unsure of what I might find. The house was eerily quiet inside, but I could still hear the thumping sound. It was now almost a pounding, as though someone was trying to break free from something. I followed the sound to the stairs and hesitated at the top. Looking down the dark hallway, I approached the first door I saw, which was slightly cracked open. As I pushed it open, I found a small, dusty room with nothing in it except for a locked door on the far wall. The thumping sound was louder now, coming from behind that door. I moved closer to the door, feeling a strange chill run down my spine. The door was old, with peeling paint and rusted hinges, but it was definitely locked. There was no key in sight. The thumping grew louder, and I could almost hear someone's voice, faintly begging for help. I tried the door handle again, but it wouldn't budge. The sound was now frantic, desperate, as if someone was trapped inside, struggling to get out. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I noticed something, a photograph on the wall beside the door. It was a picture of the Harris family, taken years ago. In the photo, the father, Mr. Harris, stood with his wife and son, but there was something strange about it. The son, Ben, was missing from the photo. His face had been scratched out, as if someone had intentionally erased him. I turned to leave, but as I did, the thumping suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. The next day, I didn't hear the sound again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to reach out to the Harris family, knocking on their door several times, but they never answered. After a week of strange occurrences and restless nights, I decided to do some digging. I learned that Ben Harris had gone missing years ago, right around the time the family moved into the house. No one knew what had happened to him. He was simply gone. Some people whispered that he had run away. Others said something darker had happened. But no one could explain the locked room I had discovered. I haven't heard the thumping sound again. But sometimes, when the night is still, I can feel something watching me from next door. The Harris family never leaves their house, and I have a feeling they never will. I still hear the thumping at night, and I'm starting to wonder if I've become part of the story. Now, just like the locked room, I may never escape. My name is Ethan, and I'm not one to believe in ghost stories or urban legends. I've always been the logical, down-to-earth type, relying on reason to get me through life. But all of that changed the day I moved into my new house on Maple Street. At first, everything seemed perfect. The house was older, but well kept, with a large front yard and a cozy atmosphere. The neighborhood was quiet, a far cry from the hustle and bustle of the city. I thought I'd found the ideal place to settle down and escape from the stress of my old life. But there was something unsettling about the neighbor's house, the one next door. It wasn't particularly spooky on the outside, but the way it always seemed to be in shadow, even during the brightest days, made me uneasy. The curtains were always drawn, and I never saw anyone coming or going. It wasn't just that the house was empty, it was as if no one had lived there for years, despite the fact that I could see a faint light in the upstairs window each night. It wasn't until the third night that I started noticing something strange. I was sitting in my living room, reading a book, when I felt its eyes on me. I glanced around the room, but there was nothing unusual. Still, the feeling didn't go away. I stood up and looked out the window, and that's when I saw them eyes there, in the upstairs window of the neighbor's house. Two dark eyes were staring at me. They were so deep, so black, they seemed to absorb the light around them. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I shook it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the next night, the eyes were back. And this time, they were closer. I could see a figure standing just behind the window, their face hidden in shadow. But those eyes, they were unmistakable. Every night after that, the eyes were there, watching, waiting. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But the longer I stayed in the house, the more paranoid I became. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. The eyes were always there, even when I turned off the lights. It wasn't until I decided to confront the situation that things really started to get strange. One evening, I walked next door, determined to meet the mysterious neighbor. The house seemed even darker up close, the windows black and lifeless. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. I tried the doorbell, but it was silent. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check around the back of the house. That's when I saw it, a small window, cracked open just enough for someone to see out. But when I peered inside, the room was empty. There was no furniture, no sign of life, just dust and decay. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a faint sound. It was a whisper, so soft I almost didn't catch it. "Help me." I spun around, but no one was there. The whisper seemed to come from inside the house, from deep within its walls. My heart raced as I ran back to my own house, slamming the door behind me. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and growing fear. The eyes in the window never stopped watching. They followed me from room to room, even when I tried to leave the house. It was as if they were always there, always waiting. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things, ready to leave Maple Street behind. As I was about to drive away, I glanced back at the neighbor's house one last time, and there, in the upstairs window, were those eyes, watching me, waiting for me to leave. But what scared me the most wasn't the eyes, it was the realization that the eyes hadn't been mine the whole time. They were someone else's, someone who had been watching me, not the other way around. I haven't been back to that house since, but I still hear the whisper sometimes, drifting on the wind. Help me. My name is Sarah, and I've always been the type to stay in my own lane. I keep to myself, and I don't get involved in anyone else's business. But when I moved into the house on Birchwood Avenue, I found myself involved in something I couldn't ignore, even if I wanted to. The house was perfect, charming, cozy, and just far enough away from the busy part of town to offer some peace. But the neighborhood, that was a different story. It wasn't exactly friendly, and the people were all a bit distant. Still, I didn't think much of it. The neighbor next door was an older man, Mr. Donovan. He was quiet and reclusive, always keeping to himself. But there was something unsettling about his house. It was a tall, narrow building with overgrown ivy creeping up the walls. The windows were always shut, and there was an eerie sense of stillness that surrounded the place. It was late one evening when I first heard the sound of crying. At first I thought it was just a passing car, but when the noise continued night after night, I realized it was coming from Mr. Donovan's house. The crying was soft at first, almost like a whimper, but then it would grow louder, almost as if someone was in pain. It would echo through the walls, disturbing the silence of the night. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe a broken pipe, but something about it felt wrong. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The sound was louder than usual, and it was nearly unbearable. I decided to go over and see if everything was okay with Mr. Donovan. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The crying continued from inside, but it was strange. There was no movement from behind the windows, no sign of life. I hesitated for a moment, but then I turned the doorknob. To my surprise, the door creaked open. Inside, the house was dark, the air thick with dust. I called out, but the only response I got was the faint sound of crying coming from upstairs. It wasn't a normal cry. There was a desperation in it, like someone was pleading for help. I made my way up the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. At the top, I found a hallway with closed doors on both sides. The crying was coming from the last door on the left. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the knob. When I opened the door, I was hit by a wave of cold air. The room was empty, except for a rocking chair that faced the corner. But as soon as I stepped inside, I heard the crying again, louder this time. It was coming from the corner, where the chair sat. I slowly approached, my breath visible in the air. When I reached the chair, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A woman, her face hidden in her hands, rocking back and forth, crying uncontrollably. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, the kind I'd only seen in pictures. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. The woman stopped rocking and slowly lifted her head. Her face was pale, and her eyes were hollow, as though she hadn't slept in years. There was something deeply wrong with her, a sadness that seemed to consume her entire being. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice weak and hoarse. "He's coming." Before I could respond, I heard a sound behind me. I turned around, but the door had slammed shut on its own. The air grew heavier, and the temperature dropped even further. Suddenly, the woman stood up and rushed toward me, grabbing my arm with an iron grip. "You need to leave," she hissed. "He's coming for you." I pulled away, fear surging through me, but the door wouldn't open. I tried again, and this time, It flew open on its own. I stumbled out of the room, running down the stairs and out the front door. As I looked back, I saw Mr. Donovan standing on the porch, his eyes locked onto mine. His expression was empty, lifeless, and for a moment, I saw something flash in his gaze, something dark and malicious. I ran back to my house, slamming the door behind me. The crying from next door continued that night, louder than ever, but I didn't dare go back. The woman in that room, her warnings, and Mr. Donovan's hollow eyes haunted me. I found out later that Mr. Donovan's wife had died years ago under mysterious circumstances. Some people say he never fully recovered from her death. They say he's been trying to bring her back ever since, and that the crying I heard every night was the sound of his failure. But there's one thing I'll never forget. The woman in the rocking chair wasn't Mr. Donovan's wife. It was something else, and whatever it was, I don't think it's ever going to leave. My name is Jason, and I've always been a skeptic. I don't believe in the supernatural, not even for a second. When I moved to the quiet suburb on Oakwood Lane, I was looking for peace and quiet, a break from the chaos of city life. The house I bought was charming, but the neighborhood, it felt strange from the start. Most of the houses on the block were well kept, but there was one that always gave me the creeps, the house on the corner. It had an overgrown yard, and the windows were always covered by thick curtains. I never saw anyone come or go from there, but every time I passed by, I would feel like I was being watched. I tried not to think much of it. My neighbors were friendly enough, except for the ones in that house. I would catch glimpses of shadows moving behind the curtains, but whenever I tried to visit or introduce myself, there was no response. It was like they weren't even there. One evening, when I was out for a walk, I noticed a light flickering inside that house. It was a pale, greenish glow, like the kind of light that only comes from an old, faulty bulb. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and something told me I should avoid it. But my curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to investigate. I walked up to the house, careful not to make a sound. The front door was slightly ajar, and the same eerie green light was spilling out from the cracks. I knocked gently, but there was no answer. I tried again, and still nothing. My hand hovered over the doorknob. It was one of those moments when you just know you shouldn't do something, but you do it anyway. I turned the knob and stepped inside. The house was silent. I couldn't hear anything except my own breathing. The air smelled old, like dust and mildew, but there was also something else. Something metallic, like iron. I called out, but my voice seemed to get swallowed by the darkness. I slowly moved through the house, the green light coming from a room at the back. As I approached, I could feel the temperature drop. My breath was visible in the air, despite it being warm outside. I pushed open the door, and there it was, the source of the light. A large, old-fashioned mirror stood against the wall. It was framed in tarnished silver, and the light was coming from within it, as if the mirror itself was glowing. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the reflection. I was standing in the room, but the mirror didn't reflect me. It reflected a figure, a man, wearing a black suit and standing in the exact spot where I was. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and he seemed to be smiling at me. Though there was no sound, I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, but the reflection didn't move with me. It stayed there, staring at me with that unsettling smile. Suddenly, I heard a voice, soft and rasping, coming from behind me. "Don't look at it." I spun around, but no one was there. The house was empty, just as it had been before. My eyes darted back to the mirror, and I saw the figure begin to move. It took a step toward me, its smile widening. "Leave now," the voice whispered again, but this time it was louder, like it was right next to me. I turned and ran, slamming the door behind me as I fled into the night. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my own house, locking the door behind me. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked into a mirror, I felt like something was just behind me, waiting. And I couldn't get the image of that man out of my head, his hollow eyes and his terrible, twisted smile. But the worst part, I know I'm not the only one who's seen him. A few days ago, I spoke to one of my neighbors, a woman named Linda. She mentioned the house on the corner, and when I told her about the man in the mirror, she went pale. "He's been there for years," she said, her voice trembling. "No one ever goes near that house because of him. He's the neighbor who never left." My name is Emily, and I recently moved to a quiet neighborhood in the outskirts of town. The houses were all charming, with large yards and old trees lining the streets. My house was no exception, but it was the one next door that caught my attention. It wasn't the house itself, but the garden. The house seemed normal enough, an old cottage-style place, slightly overgrown with ivy, but the garden next to it was strange. The plants were unlike anything I had ever seen before. Bright flowers with vivid colors bloomed in patterns. That didn't make sense. Twisting vines seemed to grow in unnatural directions, like they were reaching out, stretching towards something I couldn't see. I had never really noticed it until I moved in. But when I did, I started seeing the man who lived there. Mr. Blackwell, as he was called, was a reclusive person. He rarely left his home, but when he did, he would stare at his garden for hours. I once saw him standing in the yard, muttering to the plants as if they were alive. At first, I thought it was just an eccentricity, but then I began noticing the oddities. At night, I could hear whispers coming from his garden, soft voices floating through the air, barely audible. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night, and the lights in his house would be on, but he would never be visible, only the shadows moving behind the curtains. One day, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to take a walk in the garden, just to see what was so special about it. The moment I crossed the fence, a strange chill ran through me. The flowers were still as beautiful as ever, but now I could see that some of them had faces. Strange, contorted faces twisted into expressions of pain, anguish, and anger as I stepped further into the garden. The vines seemed to reach out to me, brushing against my skin like cold fingers. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but I couldn't turn back. Something was drawing me closer to the center of the garden. There, I found a stone statue in the middle of the flowers. It was a woman, her arms outstretched as though she were trying to embrace something or someone. The statue's face was eerily lifelike, with eyes that seemed to follow me, glowing faintly in the dark. I tried to turn away, but something stopped me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the statue. Suddenly, I heard Mr. Blackwell's voice behind me, his tone sharp and accusing. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun around, but there was no sign of him. The garden felt alive, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stumbled backward, panic rising in my chest. The plants seemed to lean toward me, their petals curling inwards like they were closing in. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, and I heard whispers growing louder. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice came from behind me, and I turned to find Mr. Blackwell standing there, his face twisted in an expression of fury. "You've seen too much," he hissed. "Now you're part of it." Before I could react, the ground beneath me began to tremble, and the plants started to twist and rise. The vines shot up, wrapping around my legs and pulling me down toward the ground. I screamed, struggling to break free, but the more I fought, the tighter they became. "You shouldn't have come to the garden," Mr. Blackwell whispered, as the earth swallowed me whole. "Now you'll never leave." The last thing I saw, before I was consumed by the darkness, was the face of the statue, its eyes still watching, still waiting. My name is Luke, and I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. I was the kind of person who needed solid evidence before I would entertain any wild ideas. That all changed the day I moved into the old Victorian house on Maple Street. The house had been on the market for months, and I couldn't understand why. It was a beautiful, well-kept place, but it had this aura of mystery surrounding it. Still, the price was right, and I was eager to start fresh in a new town. So I didn't think twice before signing the papers. My neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins, was an older woman who lived next door. She was kind enough, always giving me advice on the best places to visit in town. But one day, as I was out front mowing the lawn, she approached me with a strange warning. "You should be careful, Luke," she said, her voice low and serious. "The house you bought, it's been vacant for a long time for a reason. People say it's cursed. Don't go down into the basement." I laughed it off, thinking it was just some old town superstition. "Thanks for the heads up, Mrs. Wilkins, but I'm not one to get spooked by stories." But the more I settled into the house, the more I began to notice strange things. The house creaked at night, the floors groaned, as if something was moving in the dark. And the basement door, it always seemed to be slightly ajar, as if it was inviting me to go down. The basement had an old, rusted lock, but it was broken. The door would swing open by itself sometimes, and I could hear faint whispers coming from below. I tried to ignore it, but one night, my curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check it out. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was dark, with only the beam of my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The walls were lined with old, forgotten furniture, boxers, and cobwebs. But in the far corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. An old man sitting in a rocking chair. At first I thought I was seeing things, but as I got closer, I realized he was real. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes were wide and empty, like they had seen too much. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there, staring at me. I froze, unable to move or speak. Then, with a voice that seemed to come from all around me, he whispered, "Leave this place before it takes you to." The words echoed in my mind, and suddenly, I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest as the basement grew colder. I turned to run, but the stairs were gone. The basement had changed, was now a maze of twisting corridors, dark and suffocating. The man's laughter filled the space, sending a chill down my spine. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "Now you're mine." I ran in a blind panic, crashing through the darkness. The sound of footsteps followed me, getting closer and closer. I could feel his cold breath on my neck. I turned corners, but every time I did, the walls seemed to close in on me, pushing me toward the same place, the chair where he waited. Finally, I stumbled out of the basement, gasping for air, my body shaking with terror. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my mind racing. What had I seen? Was I losing my mind? But when I looked through the basement window, I saw something that made my blood run even colder there. In the window was the old man, staring back at me with those empty eyes. From that night on, I could never shake the feeling that he was still there, watching, waiting for me to return. And every now and then, when the wind howls through the house, I hear the creak of a rocking chair moving gently in the dark. My name is Sarah, and I've always been a people person. When I moved into my new home, I was eager to meet my neighbors and settle into the community. Most of the houses on my street were nice, but the house next to mine had always intrigued me. It was smaller, almost like an afterthought, tucked away behind a tall fence with a weathered gate that creaked every time it opened. I didn't know much about my neighbor, Mr. Carter. He was an older man, rarely seen, and when he did appear, it was always at strange hours. I would occasionally hear footsteps in his yard at night, but no one ever came or went from his house during the day. It was as though he lived in his own world, isolated from the rest of us. One day, while I was out watering my garden, I noticed something odd. The door to his house, which I had always assumed to be locked, was slightly ajar. My curiosity got the better of me, and I walked closer to take a look. The door creaked as it moved just enough to reveal the dark interior of his home. The faint smell of mildew and something rotting seemed to leak from the crack. I couldn't resist. I gently pushed the door open a bit further. The inside was dim, and I could barely make out shapes through the grime on the windows. It was the kind of place that felt like it had been untouched for years, but there was something unsettling about it. A coldness that seeped into my bones. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stepped closer to the door, listening for any signs of movement. But the house was eerily silent. I was just about to step inside when I heard a voice behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around and saw Mr. Carter standing there, his eyes wide with a strange urgency. "Mr. Carter," I stammered, caught off guard. I didn't mean to intrude. I just thought the door was open." He gave me a sharp look, his face pale and tired. "It's not safe. You shouldn't be here. Not now." Before I could ask him what he meant, he grabbed the door handle and slammed it shut, locking it with a force that made the entire house rattle. I backed away, trying to process what had just happened. Was he trying to warn me? Or was something else going on behind that door? Over the next few days, I tried to forget this strange encounter, but every time I looked at Mr. Carter's house, it seemed like something was different. The house looked darker, like the shadows inside had deepened, and sometimes I thought I could hear soft murmurs coming from within, almost like whispers. One evening, after another strange occurrence at his house, I couldn't resist any longer. I had to know what was behind that locked door. I grabbed a flashlight and waited until midnight, when the street was empty and quiet. The gate creaked as I entered Mr. Carter's yard, the old wood groaning under my weight. I crept up to the door and tried the handle. It was locked, just as I expected. But I noticed something else. There was a small window on the side of the house, partially hidden by ivy. I could just barely make out the outline of the window frame and a small opening at the top. I climbed up, heart racing, and peered inside. What I saw chilled me to the core. The room was filled with old furniture, broken chairs, dusty shelves, and piles of strange, old books. But the most disturbing thing was the wall. The entire wall was covered in what appeared to be symbols, strange, intricate patterns, some of them scrawled in what looked like blood. In the center of the wall was a large, ornate door, one that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I backed away from the window. My mind was racing. What had Mr. Carter been hiding? What was behind that door? Suddenly, the window above me slammed shut, and I heard footsteps inside the house. My heart nearly stopped as I scrambled to the ground, my breath caught in my throat. I knew I had to leave before Mr. Carter caught me there, but as I turned to run, I felt a hand grab my shoulder, pulling me back. "You shouldn't have seen it," Mr. Carter whispered in my ear, his voice trembling with fear. "Now you're part of it." My name is Jack, and I recently moved into a small, quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The house was perfect for me, tucked away at the end of a cul-de-sac with a large backyard. It was exactly what I needed after years of living in busy, cramped apartments. Everything about the place felt peaceful until I met my neighbor. Mrs. Gray was an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down from mine. At first, she seemed sweet enough, always smiling and waving when I passed by, but something about her house unsettled me. It was old and dilapidated, with overgrown ivy crawling up the sides and windows that were always shut tight. no matter how hot it got outside. It wasn't long before I began noticing strange things happening around her house. One evening, as I was walking back from the store, I saw a shadow move behind one of her upstairs windows. I thought nothing of it, assuming it was just the wind or a trick of the light. But the next day, as I drove past, I saw the same shadow again. This time, I was sure someone or something was in there. The feeling of unease grew stronger with every passing day. I started to see strange figures standing in her yard at night, always just out of sight when I tried to look directly at them. But when I went over to check on her, she would always be sitting on her porch, knitting, with an almost vacant expression on her face. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, so I decided to speak with her. One evening, I knocked on her door, and she opened it slowly, as if she had been expecting me. Her pale blue eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Jack, isn't it?" she asked in a raspy voice. "How can I help you?" "I've been noticing some strange things around your house," I said, trying to sound casual. "Shadows, figures moving around." Her lips curled into a thin smile. "You've seen them too," she murmured. "The others. They like to play tricks on the living." I laughed nervously, unsure of whether she was joking or not. "What do you mean? Are you saying there's something in your house?" She nodded slowly. "There's something in this neighborhood. Something old. Something that has always been here. But don't worry, Jack. It won't harm you, as long as you don't disturb it." The air grew thick with an unspoken tension as I stood there, trying to make sense of her cryptic words. Before I could ask her anything else, she turned and walked back into her house. Closing the door behind her, I left feeling disturbed, but tried to brush it off. That night, however, the shadows outside her house grew darker, and the whispers and the wind seemed to call my name. I couldn't sleep, and by dawn, I was staring out my window, watching Mrs. Gray's house. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall and cloaked, stood in her yard, staring directly at me. It was like it was waiting for me to make a move, daring me to step outside. I froze, too afraid to blink, too afraid to breathe. I couldn't take my eyes off it. And then, the figure started to move closer to my house, dragging its long, flowing cloak across the grass. The closer it got, the colder the air became. My heart raced as I backed away from the window, my mind screaming at me to get out, to run, to do anything. But my body wouldn't obey. The figure reached the edge of my yard, and then stopped, standing motionless. Then, it turned its head slightly to the side, as if it were watching something else, something behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, and when I turned back to look at the figure, it was gone. I don't know if it was a dream, or if I was losing my mind, but the next morning, I found a note taped to my front door. It was from Mrs. Gray. "Stay away from the shadows, Jack. They are not what they seem. They will follow you home." I never saw Mrs. Gray again. The house stayed empty, and the shadows grew darker with each passing night. But every now and then, when I look out my window, I swear I see a figure standing in the yard across the street, waiting for me to make my next move. I'm Emily, and I moved into a new neighborhood just a few months ago. The house was everything I had dreamed of: charming, a little old-fashioned, and quiet. But it didn't take long for me to realize that my new neighbor, Mr. Collins, wasn't quite as harmless as he seemed. At first, I noticed little things, strange noises coming from the house next door late at night. The faint sound of something dragging across the floor, or the way the blinds in his window never seemed to move. I chalked it up to the quirks of an older man living alone. But it wasn't long before my curiosity got the best of me. One evening, I was outside on my porch when I saw him, a thin, hunched figure moving behind his curtains. I waved, but he didn't respond. His house was old, like mine, with an attic that seemed to always be locked. But on that night, I noticed something odd. The attic window was open just a crack, and the silhouette of a figure was standing there, staring out at me. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he had visitors, or it was just a trick of the light. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences grew more intense. I started to hear soft tapping on my walls at night, as though someone was trying to communicate from the other side. The tapping always seemed to follow the rhythm of Mr. Collins's footsteps, always on the same days. At the same time, I decided to confront him. I knocked on his door, my heart pounding in my chest. When he answered, his cold eyes met mine, and I felt an unsettling shiver crawl down my spine. "What can I do for you, Miss Emily?" he asked, his voice too smooth. "Well, I was wondering if you could explain the noises coming from your house." ISTAMMERED. Mr. Collins gave a quiet chuckle, but there was something in it that didn't feel right. "I'm afraid I can't help you with that," he said, "but you'll learn soon enough." Before I could ask him what he meant, he slammed the door in my face. I stood there, stunned, and made my way back home, the eerie feeling growing stronger with every step. That night, the tapping was louder than ever, but this time, it wasn't coming from my walls. It was coming from the attic. I tried to ignore it, but the noises grew more frantic. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. In a panic, I grabbed my phone and tried calling Mr. Collins, but his line was disconnected. As I stood in the middle of my living room, trying to figure out what to do, I heard a voice, a low whisper that sent a wave of ice through my veins. "Come upstairs." Without thinking, I found myself at the bottom of the stairs that led to my attic. The door was cracked open, just enough to let a sliver of light spill through. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the handle, but I hesitated. Something told me not to open that door, but my feet moved before my mind could catch up. I turned the handle and stepped inside. The attic was freezing, colder than any place I had ever been. The air smelled damp, and I could barely see through the haze of dust. But there, standing in the corner, was Mr. Collins. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his body was contorted in an unnatural way. He spoke again, his voice trembling. "You shouldn't have come." Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I turned to look at him, but he was gone. In his place stood a figure, one that looked exactly like me, but its eyes were black as coal, and its grin stretched unnaturally wide. I screamed, but no sound escaped my mouth. As I looked around the attic, I realized that I wasn't alone. Mr. Collins wasn't the only one trapped here, and now, neither was I.